Hi, I'm James McGuire, and today we're talking about artificial intelligence, whether we can create a regulatory framework for AI that really manages it for the betterment of all humankind, which I think is a really pressing issue these days. To discuss that, I've got two thought leaders with me. With me is Jillian Hadfield, Director of the Schwartz Reisman Institute for Technology and Society. Jillian, thanks for being with us today.
Thanks, James. Really great to be here.
And I think I might have said only part of your job title. Are you also a professor? Fill me in on this, please.
I am. I'm a professor cross-appointed in the law school and the business school because I'm also an economist as well as a legal scholar. I wear many hats, but I am also on the faculty there.
Jillian, you don't goof off enough. I think that's probably, we've identified your problem. It's like, so we'll work on that later. But
that might be.
Okay. Also with us today is Zia Khan, Senior Vice President of Innovation at the Rockefeller Foundation. Zia, hello to you.
Hi, James. Great to be here with you. Thanks.
So I know the Rockefeller Foundation put out a report, and it's about AI, and it's really the reason we're all talking today. Can you give us sort of a summary of what the report is about? What's the goal of the report?
Sure. That's a great question. Artificial intelligence has been an interest of the foundation for actually a while. We were actually the funders of the 1956 conference at Dartmouth that coined the term artificial intelligence. And the whole premise was around, at that time, they wanted to do research into how can we actually replicate the human brain. It was a little bit more of an academic mathematical approach. And artificial intelligence has its ebbs and flows, but now we've seen an explosion in its use. And it's really gone beyond like an interesting technology to something that is just permeating all aspects. And we're seeing this in the COVID response right now, how artificial intelligence is both being used to accelerate, drug discovery and vaccine development, but also, highlighting some of the privacy issues as we think about contact tracing and how we can use in that context. So for us at the Rockefeller Foundation, our mission's been for 100 years, how do we promote the well-being of humanity throughout the world? And right now, as we're thinking about this COVID and pandemic situation, thinking about the near-term responses, but also how do we set the course for a recovery so it's a more equitable recovery? And we just feel guiding the development of AI now is really important to setting the stage for where we're going to go in the future. So
interesting.
That's our general thesis. The report came out of a meeting we had at our Bellagio Center. We gathered together philosophers and technologists and artists to really take a pan-society look at what is it going to take to guide responsible AI forward. And one of the zones that they zeroed in on was around governance. And that's actually where, a wonderful, thoughtful partner like Jillian comes into play, has done some deep thinking on this topic. And that's how we got connected and started to work together.
Great. All right. So I want to show a quote from the report and dig into the report and some of the issues included. Before we start, I want to thank the people who are watching and listening. Thank you so much for showing up. We welcome your questions and your comments. Please use the Q&A button down at the bottom of the screen. You know where it is because we've been staring at Zoom all these months. You don't need to wait until the end. Ask your question at any time. So we welcome your input. All right. So let me try the miracle of screen sharing. This is pretty complicated for me, but I'm going to try this. And this is a quote from the report. Key, I think you wrote this particular quote. Does this quote look familiar to you?
It does, in fact.
Let me briefly read this because I think this sums up the question as I see it. Really, it puts it in a true nutshell. It's, as we reimagine a way forward, the Rockefeller Foundation is betting that AI will help rebalance and reset the future in a way that addresses current inequities. To realize that outcome, we must develop a regulatory framework to ensure its responsible use. We need to reimagine an entire new rulemaking system that guides AI towards society's goals instead of our current de facto rulemaking system that guides AI towards the market's goals. And I think that is really the issue, but I think it's a very difficult issue because there's very large companies that have enormous budgets and they are pouring vast budgets into the development of artificial intelligence, applications, platforms, widgets, et cetera. The idea that some regulatory body, perhaps the governmental body, could actually really play referee against such powerful forces seems a little questionable. I'm doubtful of that. Jillian, give me some optimism about that if you possibly can.
I absolutely can. So I think it's really important to remember, and I've been thinking about these sets of issues for decades. first of all, really important to recognize there's no such thing as an unregulated market. Markets are constituted by law. If we think about regulation just more generally, markets are constituted by that. So the power that our large tech companies have today is in part constituted by the way the state protects contract rights, intellectual property rights, employment relationships, and so on. So that's in the tools in our toolkit are some of those basic rules and those basic things that are constituting the power of markets. But the other reason I'm optimistic about the capacity for now regulation that comes in to say, okay, you can do this with AI, but you can't do that with AI. You can use facial recognition on a phone, but you can't use it to check up on your competitors, or you can't have police departments using it in discriminatory ways. That kind of regulation, it's definitely challenging to develop that regulation today. But we faced that challenge at the last major revolution in the economy, the early 20th century. That's when we invented the regulatory state to harness and rein in the power of huge corporations at the time. Antitrust law comes out at that point. I'm pretty optimistic that we can develop those new regulatory tools. I think they're going to look different than what we have now, but I certainly think we can do it.
That is. I mean, you are more optimistic than me, which I want to get onto your optimism for sure. It seems like the forces are so powerful. And one of the things you mentioned was that you can or cannot use artificial intelligence to check up on a competitor. I mean, a lot of that is going on, and to what extent it goes on, so to speak, under the covers. I mean, would be tough to govern, but I want it to be governed. Zia, what is your take? It is optimistic to think that AI can really be governed?
Well, I find the use of the words optimistic and pessimistic kind of interesting, because I feel like there's been over time a negative connotation associated with regulation, particularly when it comes to innovation. That regulation's kind of bad. It slows things down. And to build on Jillian's point, I sometimes use this expression of, the reason we have brakes on cars is not to go slow, but so that we can go fast. And when we think of lots of markets, look at the health market, it's fairly heavily regulated, but you can't even imagine a system by which you could develop drugs or provide healthcare to people when you're thinking about their safety without a lot of that regulation. That's not necessarily a bad thing. It's kind of striking the right balance. So, and it's interesting when you showed that quote, I saw how in one place I used regulation, another place I used rule making. I know that there's all these connotations associated with regulation. And what we're talking about is a broad range. Certainly the government has a role to play, but even business practices, what does fair competition look like? What does industry standards look like? How are you going to signal to consumers that something is safe? Branding comes into play. And then there's even the community of data scientists. What are the codes and practices and the more informal rituals versus formal rules? We think of all of those elements as part of governance and as part of regulation. So if you think about, as Joan was referencing, turn of the century, when food was starting to become commercially developed and not your neighbor or not the local baker, we needed regulations to make sure that it would feel safe and be good for society. But that unlocked a lot of innovation in its own right.